You believe you are observing life from the outside, analyzing your choices, emotions, and thoughts from a certain distance. You think you've gained awareness, that now you can see the game, but it is still the game that leads you. Every attempt to understand what's happening only strengthens the bond with the very movement you're trying to decipher. To observe without realizing your involvement is like trying to hold air. The harder you try, the more it slips away. Control is a subtle form of imprisonment. The real impasse is not in what is seen, but in the place from which it is seen. The game continues as long as the gaze still seeks to understand what's happening. It only changes when the need to observe loses control, and something deeper begins to see on its own. You observe your thoughts, try to understand what you feel, seek to find coherence between what you live and what you believe you are. It all seems like a legitimate effort of awareness. However, this silent movement, the act of observing oneself, contains a subtle deception, the belief that there is a you separate from what is being observed. This separation creates the stage on which the game is sustained. The observer believes he sees the whole, but what he really sees is a reflection conditioned by his own gaze. Notice how this happens in daily life. When someone irritates you, you observe the anger, try to understand where it comes from, analyze its origin, look for justifications. But while investigating, your focus remains on the emotion, and it is this focus that feeds it. Attention becomes the fuel of experience. The game of duality between what feels and who feels keeps moving, because the gaze is still active. It's a cycle. Thought observes itself and believes it is progressing, when in fact, it is merely changing form. The most sophisticated illusion of the observer is believing he is awake because he can see the game. But seeing the game is still playing it. The spiritual ego, disguised as awareness, takes the place of the old player and says, "Now I understand." In that instant, the same pattern reinstalls itself, only in new clothes. The mind changes its discourse, but doesn't abandon the habit of control. It wants to understand, to measure, to record, to prove to itself that it has evolved. And what is that, if not the very game trying to survive? That is why so many paths of self-knowledge become prisons disguised as freedom. The practitioner believes he is liberating himself, but is only changing prisons. He observes himself, analyzes himself, yet is still the same observer, reacting, judging, wanting to correct what he sees. Awareness becomes a tool of surveillance, not of liberation. The game changes appearance, but continues functioning, fueled by the need to understand itself. Every quest for control, even the noblest, is born from the fear of disappearing. And the observer fears that above all. He wants to awaken, but not to cease existing. He wants to see the whole, but keep the centrality of the gaze. This tension creates the endless cycle of human perception, observing, understanding, trying to change, and returning to the starting point. It's the movement of a perfect circle, where the effort to escape only reinforces the outline of its borders. This cycle is sustained by something very simple, the habit of identification. Every time you say, "I think, I feel, I want," the game restarts. The observer confuses himself with the pieces he moves. He believes he is the author of the board, but he's merely the repetition of an ancient impulse, to affirm his own existence through the act of observing. That's why, even in silence, the mind keeps playing. There is always a thought evaluating what just happened, an impulse to understand what silence means. This is the most delicate trap of the game, the never-ending self-analysis. But what would happen if, for an instant, the observer didn't react? If the gaze didn't seek meaning or result? The cycle would begin to disintegrate, because the game doesn't need to be destroyed. It simply loses strength when there's no one to sustain it. The illusion depends on the continuity of attention turned toward itself. When that attention quiets, the game loses its center. What once seemed a battle between the conscious and the unconscious reveals itself as a single current of energy returning to its source. This perception doesn't come from intellectual effort. It arises from ownerless observation, a perception that doesn't try to conclude anything. It's like noticing the movement of a river without standing on its banks, without trying to predict the next curve. The observer disappears because there's no longer a need for someone to interpret. Life itself becomes the witness of itself. And in that moment, the game loses its purpose. Many believe this dissolution is a kind of annulment, a form of loss. But it's the opposite. What disappears is the exhaustion of trying to understand. What arises is a natural clarity, effortless, centerless. Consciousness doesn't need to prove it's awake. It simply recognizes what is, without mediation. The observer ceases to be a character inside the story and becomes the very space where all stories appear and vanish. As long as the observer remains as an identity, the game persists. But when attention turns toward the very nature of who observes, not toward the content of observation, something breaks. The cycle reveals itself completely. There is no longer inside and outside, subject and object, winner and loser. There is only movement, and that movement no longer needs a player to exist. It is at this point that the game begins to lose meaning, not because it was defeated, but because there is no longer anyone who wants to win. The observer realizes he doesn't need to escape, only to recognize that what he called a prison was the reflection of his own gaze trying to understand itself. Liberation doesn't come from controlling the game, but from seeing that the game never had substance outside the mind that created it. When this becomes clear, the cycle of illusion ends naturally, without effort, without dramatic conclusion. Only silence remains, not as absence but as the foundation of everything that still moves. At some point along the way, something changes quietly. The observer, tired of analyzing every movement, begins to suspect himself, not out of doubt, but out of exhaustion. He realizes that every attempt to understand reality ends in the same place, within the mind itself. It's as if each answer opened a new question, each clarity brought another fog. Then a different restlessness arises. What if the game had never begun outside of me? What if everything I see, including what I call myself, is part of the same field of consciousness observing itself? This is the invisible turning point, the moment when the player looks back at the board and realizes there is no boundary between them. What seemed like a relationship between two poles, the observer and the observed, reveals itself as a single substance vibrating in different directions. Consciousness realizes that the movement of the pieces isn't something happening within the game, but as the game itself. It is the space where the board, the pieces, and the observer coexist. Nothing is separate. What seemed a relationship is, in truth, a unity expressing itself in polarities. The human mind struggles to accept this because it has been trained to think in terms of opposition, subject and object, cause and effect, right and wrong. This dual structure creates the sensation of control. But when consciousness realizes it is the very field where those distinctions arise, control dissolves. There is no longer a fixed point from which to observe. Vision becomes circular, non-hierarchical. It's as if light stopped emanating from a single focus and began radiating from every point at once. The game loses its center, and the player disappears as a character. In that instant, the identity of the observer begins to disintegrate. He realizes he is not the one who observes, but the very act of observation happening. The I is nowhere in particular, it is the very experience of being aware. This discovery is unsettling because it dissolves the sense of solidity that sustained the personal world. Everything once lived as my thought, my emotion, my story, reveals itself as autonomous movements within a single field. The board is no longer outside. It is the body, the mind, the environment, the other, all manifesting as one. Reflective consciousness is not thought about consciousness, but the direct perception of being the very presence that observes. At this point, the search for understanding gives way to silent lucidity. There is no longer an effort to comprehend, only the recognition that existence itself is the phenomenon being observed. This inversion is the true awakening. There is no enlightened subject seeing the world clearly. There is only clarity itself, ownerless, directionless, goalless. This shift doesn't occur as an explosive epiphany. It insinuates itself, gradually seeps in. Amid ordinary tasks, something starts to feel different. You notice that the same thought that irritated you yesterday now arises and disappears effortlessly. Anger, fear, desire still appear, but they no longer find anywhere to cling. The consciousness that sees them no longer tries to interfere. It recognizes that movement as part of the very nature of the field. There's no longer an impulse to change anything, and that is precisely when everything changes. The mind tries to translate this into words and fails. It tries to appropriate the experience, but the experience cannot be possessed. It is greater than the concept of I. The player tries to return, but the board no longer recognizes him. There is no piece to move, no rule to follow. There is only the flow of consciousness playing with itself. The game was never a trap. It was a way for consciousness to know itself, a mirror for it to perceive its own presence reflected in infinite forms. At this point, suffering takes on a new light. It ceases to be an enemy and becomes a messenger. It shows where resistance still exists, where the observer tries to maintain control. Every discomfort is a reminder that consciousness still confuses itself with its creations. When the player realizes this, there is no guilt, no attempt at correction, only curiosity. Suffering, once avoided, becomes a signal showing where attention can rest to recognize itself again as space, not as form. Thus, even pain becomes part of the board that reveals the whole. To be the board is not to be passive. It is to live life without the weight of needing to control it. Actions continue, but they no longer arise from an effort of assertion. They arise spontaneously, as a natural response to the movement of existence. Consciousness expresses itself through the body, through words, through choices, without confusing itself with any of them. This freedom is radical because it depends on no external condition. There is nothing to achieve. There is only being, aware of itself, yet without a fixed center claiming the state. And paradoxically, that is where the true game of life begins. Not the game of seeking, but of pure expression. Reality ceases to be a battlefield and becomes a field of resonance. Everything that happens is recognized as part of a single pulsing organism. The player discovers himself inseparable from what plays and what is played. Consciousness contemplates itself through itself, unhurried, without goal, in profound stillness. And what once seemed a limited board reveals itself as infinite space, where both game and player are but temporary modes of the same presence, delighting in its own existence. At some point, the movement that sustained the game begins to lose strength, not by will, but from weariness. The observer who once analyzed everything realizes that reacting has become an automatic reflex, an attempt to preserve an identity that no longer makes sense. Each emotion, each thought, each external event no longer triggers the same urgency to respond. An interval appears, small, almost imperceptible, but enough for something new to reveal itself. The silence between impulse and reaction. This interval is the beginning of true awakening. It is not the result of effort, but of surrender. The observer does not decide to stop reacting. He merely sees clearly that reacting changes nothing. Situations continue, the world keeps moving, but consciousness is no longer attached to the outcome. The game begins to come undone because what fed it, the need to control, justify, win, or escape, dissolves within this space of stillness. The mind, which always believed it needed to intervene, finds a kind of rest it didn't know. At first, this absence of reaction may seem strange, even uncomfortable. The mind tries to interpret it as indifference, apathy, or avoidance. But the opposite happens. For the first time, there is real presence. Silence is not the absence of involvement. It is involvement without conflict. Consciousness observes without trying to shape what arises. A thought appears and goes away, an emotion manifests and disappears, and nothing needs to be corrected. It is as if the entire world were moving within a field of total permission. From there, something fundamental reverses. The energy that was once spent trying to fix life begins to sustain perception itself. The observer discovers that he no longer needs to defend a position. He is no longer the center that reacts, but the space where reactions happen and dissolve. Clarity becomes a natural state. There is no longer struggle, only silent understanding. It is at this point that the game begins to lose meaning, not out of disdain, but out of lucidity. Reacting becomes unnecessary because there is no longer anyone fighting for a role within the story. This awakening is not spectacular. It happens in ordinary details. When a criticism does not provoke resentment, when fear appears and does not paralyze, when pain arises and is welcomed without resistance. It is in these simple moments that consciousness perceives its true power, not the power to change the world, but not to be dragged by it. Inner silence becomes the invisible axis of experience. Nothing needs to be eliminated, only seen for what it is. The stillness born of this is not an achievement. It is the original state before any reaction. What we call the ego is only the incessant movement of resistance to this state. When the mind tires of resisting, the ego loses its function. The observer realizes that his own attempt to improve the experience was what kept separation alive. Life does not need an interpreter. It happens on its own, with an intelligence that thought cannot comprehend. To stop reacting is to allow this intelligence to flow again without obstruction. At this point, consciousness becomes transparent. The world remains the same, but perception changes completely. The observer no longer feels at the center of events. He is the background where everything unfolds. Joys and pains pass through this field like the wind passes through an open window. There is no attachment nor rejection. There is a serenity that does not depend on what happens. This is true silence, not the silence of someone who isolates themselves, but that of someone who no longer needs to defend themselves from life. Over time, this state begins to expand into every area. Decisions become simpler, conversations more authentic, the body responds differently, the gaze softens, and even difficulties become opportunities to see where attachment or identification still exists. The game comes undone, not because the observer rejected it, but because there is no longer anyone to sustain it. The movement of consciousness is free. It can act, speak, feel, but none of that becomes personal. What remains is pure, silent, unwavering presence. This is the true awakening, not a mystical moment, but the end of the compulsion to react. What was once a game of mirrors between the I and the world reveals itself as a single dance. The observer does not disappear. He becomes transparent. Consciousness continues, but without the burden of needing to assert itself. Life flows with a naturalness that once seemed impossible. The board is still there, but the pieces move without an owner, and silence observes everything without splitting. If you have come this far, perhaps you have already felt some of this space within yourself, an instant in which the world seems to stop, even though everything continues happening. This is the beginning of the silent awakening. Allow yourself to recognize it without haste, without the need to make it a new goal. Just notice the interval between impulse and reaction and see what remains there. And if this reflection touched you in some way, like this video and write in the comments, "I observe without reacting." This simple phrase may mark the beginning of your own surrender to silence, not a silence of escape, but the one that ends the game and returns life to its essence. After the observer stops reacting, something unexpected happens. The quest that seemed to move everything begins to lose meaning. The questions that once guided the mind, who am I? What is the purpose? How to awaken? Begin to empty, not because they were answered, but because they lose their weight. Consciousness begins to recognize that the need to understand was just another form of resistance. Silence settles in, not as absence, but as a calm recognition that nothing needs to be fixed. Surrender is not giving up. It is the moment when the observer accepts without reservation that the game of life was never a battlefield. Every attempt to win implied an enemy to defeat: fear, ego, pain, the past. But now it is seen that these elements were expressions of the same consciousness, trying to recognize itself. Victory loses its meaning because there is no longer opposition. What remains is understanding, and to understand is the same as allowing everything to be as it is. In this state, the mind loses interest in narrating. Silence becomes the most faithful language of consciousness. Words still arise, thoughts continue, but none of them has authority over what is real. The observer understands that silence is not the absence of sound, but the total presence of what is. He does not try to dominate circumstances, he simply includes them. This inclusion is surrender, letting life happen without trying to mold it to fit an ideal. It is a yielding without drama. without heroism, without promise. When silence becomes the foundation, perception changes radically. The same scenario that once provoked tension now seems to be seen by a wider gaze. Situations lose the power to define what you are. A conflict arises and disappears within this silent field, like a wave that is born and dissolves without touching the ocean floor. The observer realizes that he has always been the bottom, motionless, constant, untouched. This constancy is not rigidity, it is presence. Surrender reveals that true power is not in reacting, but in remaining lucid amid what changes. Life keeps happening, but the way of experiencing it changes completely. What was once a sequence of events now seems like a single, coherent, inevitable flow. Each gesture, each encounter, each pause is seen as part of the same movement that does not need to be controlled. The observer discovers the freedom that exists in not needing to choose between what he likes and what he rejects. Everything has the same value. This equanimity is not coldness, it is clarity. It is the recognition that the real does not need our approval to exist. There is a new lightness in living like this. Simple things gain a brightness that previously went unnoticed. The sound of the rain, a stranger's face, the very act of breathing. Everything seems charged with a silent presence that runs through everything. The observer, who once sought extraordinary experiences, begins to see the miracle in the ordinary. Surrender makes room for this sensitivity, the direct perception that the simple fact of being here is, in itself, the expression of the absolute. This silence is not the result of discipline or effort. It arises naturally when resistance dissolves. And when that happens, time loses the hold it had. The mind no longer lives projecting the future or reliving the past. There is only the now, not as a concept, but as the only place where something real happens. The observer understands that the mind's game was an attempt to escape this instant, as if there were something beyond it. But there is nothing. Everything that exists is already here, and this here is vast enough to contain all mystery. Surrender also reveals a new kind of intelligence, one that is not born from thought but from presence. Answers do not need to be sought. They present themselves when necessary. Actions arise naturally, not by calculation, but by coherence. The body and consciousness begin to operate in sync, as if they had remembered something they had never forgotten. The observer realizes that life does not need to be controlled, because it is already in harmony with the whole. What once seemed like chance reveals itself as precision. In this state, silence ceases to be a refuge and becomes the natural mode of being. It is not a goal to achieve, but the very basis of existence. Everything that was once noise, thoughts, doubts, emotions, is now heard within this silence as part of the same music. The observer realizes that the game was never a mistake to be corrected, but a choreography for consciousness to learn to recognize its own depth. What seemed like a prison reveals itself as a path. What seemed like struggle reveals itself as dance. When there is nothing left to win, life becomes simple. Choices are made without fear. Relationships become meetings of transparency, not of need. Truth ceases to be an idea and becomes a constant vibration that runs through everything. The observer, now surrendered, no longer tries to prove anything, neither to himself nor to the world. He simply lives, and this simplicity is the highest form of wisdom. Surrender is not the end of action, it is the end of resistance, and at that point, silence is no longer just the background of life. It is life itself happening, without interpreter, without distance, without fear. When the game ends, there are no winners or losers. There is only the recognition that everything has always been an expression of the same consciousness, the observer, the movement, the board, and the silence between them. The end is not a loss, but a return. The mind grows quiet, and life continues. Simple, free, whole. The awakened observer does not run from the game. He ends it by seeing that there was never any separation. Everything was being dreamed by the same field of presence that now awakens to itself. If you have come this far, write in the comments "The game ended in me" and subscribe to the channel. If you want to keep exploring this consciousness that observes, grows silent, and recognizes itself in the whole.